There's no question that the elbow escape is by far and away the most common and the most widely employed escape to side control. Reminding you all that if we're across someone's side, what they're ultimately looking to do is to connect elbow and knee. They start with inside elbow position, then they fight to get the knee inside the hip, and they win the battle of inside position, and they get this frame connected inside my hips and elbows, and as a result they can push, their head moves away, second foot comes in, and as a result they're back in guard position. Okay, so this is the basic idea behind an elbow escape. Let's understand that the way the elbow escape works in these situations is always predicated on the idea of a space around my hip. So you will see that there is a space in front of my hip that the elbow escape takes advantage of. From the situation where I'm across side, you will see that space right there. If Placido can match his knee position in front of that space, then for every inch that he shrimps out, he will be able to get his knee inside an inch until his right knee occupies the space inside my hip. Once that occurs, he can push with his right knee, and I lose control of his head. As his body lines up with mine, now he gets inside foot position, then he gets inside knee position, and from here he's back in guard. Okay? So it's all built around this exposure of that space in front of my hip. And that is exactly what you've got to deny to your opponent. So when we're in here, when I see his knee trying to come in, I want to make sure that I pivot away and I, as it were, deny that space. As he tries to bring the knee in, I just sit my hips through. Now you can see there's no space between my right hip and his rib cage. The more space between my right hip and his knee, the easier it is for him to break through and get into that hole that I've created. What I want to do is I want to make this hole in front of my hip disappear. So as his knee comes into that hole, look how I just rise and just turn my hips away. So there's no space between my right hip and his rib cage. No space for that knee to come inside. Now, when he tries to elbow escape, there's nothing to work with. All that's required to do now is to correct his head position, come back, and return to square. Every time I see Placido trying to bring that knee in, I must always take the time to pivot away and deny that space that he needs to work with. I can always return back where he came from. Okay, so that's the first form of sit out. This form of sit out occurs anytime I have a crossface in place. If I'm working with a reverse crossface, then I will sit out usually in the opposite direction. Again, there's a space for Placido's knee to come in. In this circumstance, I'm going to sit out in the opposite direction. And again, the space that he needs to work with is denied from him. Okay? And as a result, we're in a position now where I can plant my hand as a blocker and walk away from my training partner. Every time I see my opponent bringing the knee in, we start this action of sitting through and denying the space in front of the hip. And I block with my hand and end up in good position. If I come back into a conventional crossface, then we'll sit out in the opposite direction. He brings the knee in, and we sit through and deny the space that he needs to work in front of the hip. Then we come back up. He goes to bring the knee inside. I deny, push, and go to work. Now, this is good, but we need to go further. A very important way to hold side control, which shuts down your opponent's elbow escape, is a variation of the sit through. This is a floating sit through where you float over your opponent's hip. Again, we're trying to deny the space in front of the hip that his knee can enter into. So what I'll often do in these situations is, as my opponent is interested in bringing the knee in front of my hip, going back, we will move towards our training partner's hips. And keeping my knees off the floor, we will float over our training partner's hip and maintain hip-to-hip contact. This creates a situation where there is zero space between my hip and his. It's that space between our hips that he needs to hit an elbow escape. It may well be the case under these circumstances, you might want to work with open hands. Okay, don't always just have your hands religiously locked like so. Be prepared to use open hands on occasion. When Placido goes to elbow escape, it's very, very difficult. If I'm a little slow and Placido successfully brings the knee inside, you can still hit this move. Again, I sit out and then I move and advance past his knee. Right now I'm losing the battle. His knee is getting inside my hip. So I take my knee, I pull up on his head, and I take my knee forwards towards the armpit. Then from here, once I beat the knee, I turn back towards it. And I walk backwards, pushing, 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 until we get that same hip-to-hip position. You always have the choice of coming back to a squared position. But if I feel Placido's winning the battle for inside position, I must react to this. When he tries to put me back in guard, we pull up on the head and I beat his knee. Once we beat the knee, we don't just naively come up to our knees and have him beat us again. Rather, we walk backwards, clearing into a situation where my hip is right in on his hip. So when he goes to elbow escape, it's exceptionally difficult. And at any given moment, we can always come back in. Now, we want to avoid situations where you're constantly fighting against his knee. Every time you feel his knee coming in and you've beaten the knee, you may well want to switch grips and go to a reverse overhook. Why? Because when you hit reverse overhooks, you get an ability now to use your hand as a blocker. Rather than using my hip to block his knee, I can use my shoulder. I walk the hand down and get my shoulder close to his hips. Very often to complete this, we'll come into a kind of quasi north-south position. As Placido goes to bring his knee in, it's completely shut out now by my shoulder, forearm, and hand. His elbow escape is almost worthless in this position because your shoulder easily dominates inside your opponent's hip. If I didn't have this, well, his knee would easily find the inside position. If you're a day late and a dollar short and the knee is coming inside, don't be afraid to hand assist. You can sit through to a degree where you can place a hand on your training partner's foot. Even as your training partner goes to bring the knee in, you can easily clear it out. Once cleared, we take our hand and punch through. We come up to our base, my ear on his far hip, my shoulder on his near hip. So when he goes to complete the elbow escape, he's completely shut out. So, putting all this into context, we've got a talented opponent, his arms are in tight, and from here, we've got a fairly conventional side pin position. I see his knee coming in. There's a danger now of me losing the pin overall. So I start that action of walking and beating my training partner's knee. So I lift up on the head, I beat my training partner's knee. Now I start the action of walking back, coming back hip to hip. So when he goes to relock his elbow escape, it's just not there. Now, when I need stability to launch my attacks, I'll come into a side control. If I'm worried about my opponent consistently bringing that knee in and hitting that elbow escape, we can sit out in the opposite direction. Even if the knee comes in, we can use a hand assist to clear it. Then we block. My knees come in, and we find ourselves wedged in a very tight side position. Okay? And you can constantly play against your opponent's elbow escape in this fashion. Every time you see him bringing that knee in, you're going to get those opportunities to walk past your training partner's knee. It comes in, look how I come up, and my knee advances forward and beats his knee. Then I start the action of walking backwards and covering hip to hip. When he tries to bring the leg back in, it's not easy. When it's time for us to come back into attacking position square, so that we can launch our various attacks, and so be it. We'll be in the square position. But every time I see him going for his elbow escapes, we're consistently walking elbow escape. We're consistently walking forward, beating our training partner's knee, and then coming back hip to hip. We can do so in two directions. And from here, all of the various attacks that we'll be looking at throughout this video come into play. Done in this way, you can shut down your opponent's elbow escape with minimum fuss and play between sitting through, forwards, backwards, and square. As you move around your opponent, be aware that your number one priority is denying that space in front of your hip. If you can do this, you can make it extremely difficult for your opponent to interfere with an elbow escape. We've been looking at the idea of countering an elbow escape. Now, if the elbow escape is the number one method of getting out of side control, a very close number two is the knee escape. Please understand that the knee escape encapsulates quite a few different varieties of escape because it forms the first half of many different escapes to side control. That's why it's seen so often, because it can branch off in different directions. Okay, first let's understand what a knee escape is. Solo, we have an opponent who does a good job of first getting an underhook. That's necessary. You can't hit knee escapes if you don't have an underhook. Otherwise you come right up into a crossface. Now, from here, our opponent scissors the bottom leg underneath the top leg and comes up to their knees. Once they get to their knees, they have a choice. Some opponents are going to lock their hands on a single leg. Some opponents are going to lock the waist and then sit to variations of guard. Some guys like half guard, some guys like butterfly guard. That's their choice. And the third variation is to have their two elbows on the floor so they can roll over a shoulder and put you back in guard. Let's have a look at how these might appear. Okay, if I'm across Placido's side and I've done a good job of solidifying the position, but he's done a good job of maintaining good tight elbow to torso position. That elbow to torso position is the key to his escape. Even if I have a crossface, if he can get his elbow underneath my armpit, he can effortlessly pommel in. If he cannot get his elbow inside, he can still pommel in, but it's a lot harder. Okay, why? Elbow in. Yep. If I'm inside his elbow, when he goes to pommel, he's got to pommel past my shoulder. So when he goes for that pommeling action, it's possible if he hits a good hard bridge, he might get there eventually, but it's harder. It's better for him to have his elbow inside. That way, just a simple little pop with his hips will easily get the arm in the inside position. Now, there's very little to stop him coming up to his knees, like so. First choice, he comes in and locks a single leg. If he can lock the single leg and then pull my knee across, he can put me down. Second option, he comes up, and instead of going around my leg, he elects for my waist. One good option from here is for him to slide this knee towards my knee and step over my leg and go to an elbow. From here, he has an excellent half guard position. Another option, similar to this. Again, he comes up. Like before, he slides his knee towards my knee, but he leaves enough space to put this foot inside, so that when he pulls himself in, he ends up in varieties of open guard. Usually butterfly guard is the most common. Third option is for the opponent to pommel up. But this time, instead of grabbing me, just put his elbows on the floor. That means he can roll over the near side shoulder and put me back in variations of guard position. Here he's chosen closed guard, he could have chosen butterfly guard or what have you. So these are the most common ways of employing this action of getting up to the knees. The commonality between them all is you've got to get up to your knees. So that's usually the best place to attack this kind of defensive movement. The first attack that we use works against any of them early on in the movement. It works against your opponent getting up to his knees, and this is an elbow block, go behind. So if we have an opponent in front of us, and I start to identify the fact that his elbow has gained the inside position, I should already be getting a little nervous if someone's elbow gets inside. That should already be a subject of concern. So what we'll start doing is just slinking our weight back a little bit. When I see my opponent pommel to the underhook, no surprises what's coming next, so I put my outside leg up. Now I take my hand and I thumb post the head. So that as Placido starts coming up, I'm just going to put my knee over his head and lock it in place. As soon as that occurs, we get an opportunity now to take our other elbow and go across and block his hips. So that as Placido comes up, we're in a position now to walk around behind him and end up behind his arms, like so, right on his back. So his escape turned into your back take. But that's always what we're looking for. So once again, we have an opponent in front of us. From here, I notice his arm has gotten into a good position. Even as this occurs, I should be getting concerned. As he starts the action of coming up, I push the head down and cover it with the inside of my knee. As I turn to face my training partner's hips, my other elbow goes over his body so that I'm still over him. Okay, so if he turned back the other way, you'd go right back into a pin. Try to stay over your opponent's hips with your chest. Don't be in a rush to come down here. He comes out the back door and now you're in trouble. Okay, stay over his hips. The way you stay over the hips is by covering the head. Then we just turn in this direction. Once we make that turn, our elbow goes over. As I see my opponent continuing up, thinking he's got that good escape position, we end up in perfect attacking position over our man, ready to attack in numerous ways. Okay, so that's a very intuitive and effective way of stopping the move early. Now, a natural question for you guys to be asking is, okay, well, that's cool, but what if I don't stop it early? What if the guy does get up to his knees before I can hit my elbow lock go behind? Don't worry, there's still good solutions. Let's look first at the situation where our opponent grabs the single leg. Okay, so we were a day late and $1 short, and the guy came up like so. We did get over the head, but he got up to his knees first. When we see this, the thing we can't do is let our opponent lock and start moving around behind us. If I hold a conventional whizzer and he has a shoulder behind my hamstring, it's pretty easy for him to walk around behind, and now you've got to go into all kinds of late defenses. There's still things you can do, but it's getting harder. Back down. So what should we be looking to do? From a situation where he starts pommeling in and coming up, we put in a belly whizzer here. As he comes up, we stuff the head underneath us. And we want to fix our body up square to him. Everything sprawled back. When he goes to circle around behind us, we should be constantly looking to square ourselves up to him. Hands going inside, etc. I want to consistently look, turning, to seize my opponent's leg from the inside. Not like this, here. So when he goes to circle behind, it's very, very difficult. Once we're squared up to him, we've got our hips back, we've got to remove these hands. So we start blocking here at the knees. Then we just shimmy back down the mat until the hands come off. Now, I don't want to lock naively and he ducks out and you end up in trouble. So from here, I bring my elbows short. I take my knees off the mat, and as a result, we can start going behind our training partner. Once I get behind the elbows, we go in and we cover the hips. Once the hips are covered, then from here, we can start putting on our tight waist, breaking our training partner down to the mat, and end up in very good attacking position. So once again, we have an opponent who's managed to get that underhook position. From here, he gets up and runs right into that tight waist. Our body should be well arched at this point. As he goes to drive, his feet will start coming up off the mat and we can get a hold of a good grip. Now, from here, we're squaring up. We place our hands on our training partner's knees. We'll start that action of shimmying back. From here, get good control. I put my hand in as a blocker and we come around the corner and cover our training partner's hips. Once we've done a good job of covering the hips, we're constantly looking to pull him down to the mat, rip up on our training partner's wrist and drive this shoulder straight down to the floor. So when he goes to pull guard or any of those other things, it's just so difficult. Now, next obvious question, well, what if this guy's more like a jiu-jitsu kind of fighter and he wants to pull guard on me? Okay, that's certainly a good move for your opponent to do, but like any move, it has its shortcomings. As my opponent comes up, we notice his foot starts coming up. Let's turn. Now, once this foot comes up, you'll notice immediately his head and his knee come quite close together. Presumably he's grabbing me around the waist. From here, to sit to guard, he's going to have to slide to a hip. But when he does so, he gives us an easy cradle lock. Okay, why is it so easy? Because his knee and his head are so close together. The very action of pulling guard in this fashion, sliding, puts the knee right next to the hip and makes for an easy lock. When he goes to pull his head back, when he goes to complete the guard pull,
it's just not going to happen.
He can't do it. Because to complete the guard pull, his head has to move away. That's what's required. So by locking a cradle, you're denying that. Now, the one thing I want to negate is this arm around my waist. So as Placido goes to pull guard, I want to walk my hips and knees back so his arm comes off. Now I take my knee and I put it behind his knee, just like so, as a blocker. Now I reach across to my training partner's far wrist or a seatbelt. I leave it up to you. Now I take my inside foot and put it inside his legs. Then my knee comes around the corner and we end up in perfect position to lock up and take our training partner's back. So his guard pull becomes your back take. Let's have a look at that again. My opponent starts the action of coming up. I notice he's going for that guard pull. From here, even as his arm's tight around my waist, we lock up an initial cradle. He finds to his disappointment that when he goes to move his head back to complete the guard pull, the cradle makes it impossible. Now, I walk my hips away from his tight waist grip. I put my knee as a blocker behind his knee, and my hands go in like so. Even as my head goes across his body, we end up in the perfect position to go around the corner and lock up the figure of four. Now, you're probably asking at this point, okay, that's cool, but what about that last one you showed where the guy rolls the guard? I've seen that a lot in jiu-jitsu. How do you deal with that one? Well, same idea. Your opponent's going to need the underhook. He's going to need to come up onto his knees, but this time you notice he doesn't connect you. It looks like an easy back take, okay, but really it's not, because go back, even as they're coming up, they're already putting the shoulder down and putting you back in guard. That was probably the slowest guard I've seen in my life.
Faster.
So from here, we see our opponent come up, and then even as he comes up, he rolls through and puts you back in guard. Okay, so it's a common and effective form of defense. So what should we be looking to do? Once I see my opponent coming up, you know the shoulder he's going to have to roll over. There's no secret here. All I'm going to do at this point is put my hand around my training partner's waist. I'm going to avoid the temptation to keep my head over the far side. It looks like it's going to be an easy seatbelt. It looks like, oh man, this is going to be easy. I'm going to take his back. It's not that easy. When he pushes off his 2 feet, he pressures my elbow because my head was on the wrong side of his body. And as a result, when he rolls through on it, he beats my elbow and comes out into guard position. Okay? So what should I be looking to do? When he comes up, I get my tight waist and I put my head down on the same side as him. I avoid the temptation, so natural for most jiu-jitsu players because they get bored up doing seatbelts, to put the head on the opposite side. I put everything down on this side. Even as Placido goes into his roll, I put my head down, and as he goes to roll, I roll through with him. Then I seize my training partner's wrist, and I put his shoulder down on the floor. So when he goes to roll another time, it's impossible to shoulder on the mat. He has to get his shoulder off the mat. Okay? So let's have a look at that again. Here we are. Our opponent comes up. From this position, I put in a tight waist. I avoid the temptation to put my head over here. Okay, his roll, his entire rolling body weight is stronger than your elbow. So instead, I put my head down and I roll in the same direction he's rolling. I just tripod up, and as he goes into his roll, I just stay behind him with my hips. Now I have his wrist, and as a result, I can touch his shoulder down on the mat. As soon as the shoulder goes down on the mat, I don't want his hips coming up a second time, so I just sit over my training partner's legs. Most of the time from here, the easiest way to ensure that he ends up in bottom position is to put on a quick half, punch it through, and then sit our man down into a good pin. And from here, it's very hard for him to hit elbow escapes. There's no rolling escapes, there's no knee escapes, none of that. So, that's how we take a skilled opponent who's based their game around the two kingpins of side control escape, the elbow escape and the knee escape. Please understand that the knee escape is kind of like a multifunctional escape. Once you get up to your knees, you've got a bunch of ways you can go. You can go into your single leg. You can go into your guard pulls. You can go into your shoulder rolls. But they all start the same way. Once you understand that these are by far and away the major forms of escape to side control, and you can shut them down, you're going to be a very difficult person to dislodge. And if it's difficult for your opponent to dislodge you, then you can start focusing on all the offense that we'll be looking at throughout this video. The first step in going from the pin to a submission is to beat your opponent at the elbow. In the case of side control, that means penetrating the elbow. First method we're going to look at is the use of an underhook. Okay, now what does it mean to say penetrate the elbow? That means to put something between my opponent's elbows and his ribs. For him to be in a defensively responsible position, he has to keep his elbows tight to his ribs with nothing between them. That's what's going to enable him to get inside my legs for elbow escapes, inside my hips for elbow escapes, to pommel into an underhook and come up to knee escapes, etc., etc. It's all predicated on the idea that there is nothing between his elbows and his ribs. That's what enables Placido to pommel to an underhook. That's what enables Placido to get his elbow inside my hip, inside elbow escaping, etc. Okay, so what we want to do is to create situations where I put my wrist and forearm between his elbow and his ribs. That enables him, bring your elbow down to your ribs, buddy. That enables me to lever my training partner's elbow and body around. Okay, so I can use my arm as a lever and his rib cage as a fulcrum to lever him up and bring his elbow away from his body into a position of vulnerability. What he wants is to be in tight with nothing between his elbows and his ribs. What we want is to penetrate and create that lever arm so that we can start moving that man around. Okay, so that's always what we're looking for. Now, we both know that, and we're going to assume that he's the same size and skill level as you. How are you going to penetrate that elbow? How are you going to go from here, where it's almost impossible for me to penetrate, to here. Okay, what we need is some mechanism that takes his hand down his body and creates a 90-degree structure that my hand can penetrate and get my wrist behind the elbow. As long as his hands are up here, that's going to be very, very difficult. So, how are we going to get to this underhook? A bunch of ways we can do it. One excellent way when we're across our training partner's side is to use a 10-finger method, okay? Where from a situation where I'm across side, I take my hand and I'm just going to punch my hand underneath Placido's wrist. When I go through, I want to minimize the cross section of my hand. So I make my hand like a spear, just like so. So from a situation where I'm holding him down, I take my hand and I penetrate through the wrist. Now from here, I take my hands and I lock a 10-finger grip on my training partner. I now use my elbow to roll my training partner's arm forward and bring the hand out, just like so. Now I put my head in front of his fist. I shoot my hand through underneath, and lo and behold, we've got the underhook that we were looking for. Let's have a look at all that again. Changing the angle. From here, I'm across my training partner's side. He's in a defensively responsible position. From here, we've got a good crossface in place, and I want to get to an underhook. As long as his hand is here on my shoulder, I don't have anything to work with. So I'm going to take my hand and I'm going to punch it through that small gap between his wrist and his shoulder. I'm going to take my second hand and I'm going to lock a 10-finger grip so that I can lever his elbow down to the mat. I can use my elbow to sweep his out and get my head down to my own hands. If I keep my head up and I try to pommel in, he'll re-pommel and take his underhook. So it's important from in here that once I come through and lock, look how I bring his hand out and I bring my head to my own hands. So when he tries to re-pommel through, there's no space. And as a result, I can go through and get to my underhook. From there, we're in the perfect position to start the action of creating that lever arm that we're always looking for. Okay, so once again, we've got a guy in a good tight defensive position. From here, I take my hand through that small gap. I lock up a 10-finger grip, and even as Placido is strong and resistant from here, look how I just lever his arm out, get my chin down to my own hands. Now from here, I lock up and find myself in good attacking position with my wrist between his elbow and his ribs. You've got that lever arm in place and you're ready to play. We're looking at the idea of satisfying the first step in our side control system. Whenever we're across someone's side, we've got to go beyond just pinning people. Okay, we've got to go from pin to submitting people. And that means taking their arms out of position. What is good position from Placido's perspective is his elbows close to his sides. Okay, that's when it's hardest for me to submit people. That's when it's easiest for him to get inside position and start working his escapes on me. He can get inside position with his near side, relax, buddy. He can get inside position with his near side and he can hit elbow escapes. He can get inside position with the far side, get underhooks and go into knee escapes. Like so. So inside position is the key for Placido. That's what makes him hard to attack and it sets up his escape. What I want to do is steal inside position from him. I want to be able to get my hand inside and under Placido's elbow and lever his elbow away from his body. And as a result, I now have control of an arm, which we can broker into various forms of submission holds. So essentially there's a battle for inside control going on here. In the previous move, my opponent had inside control and we were able to use a 10-finger method to lever his elbow outwards, put our head down, and then steal the inside control from our training partner, okay? Now, sometimes you don't have to steal inside control from him. There are going to be many times where your opponent is spontaneously moving around, and you're going to see spontaneous opportunities to simply pommel an arm inside. Okay, understand what pommeling is here, guys. Every time I go to pommel my arm in, Placido has an opportunity to pommel his own arm in. And as we pommel spontaneously, we get a fight where he's trying to get his arm inside my bicep and I'm trying to get my arm inside his. Okay, what we want to do to shut this down is every time I pommel in, I want to take away space so that when he goes to re-pommel, it's difficult. Okay, so there's going to be many times when he's working from bottom side control that this arm will spontaneously start to come down like so. And when it does, space is going to start to develop. Why might this happen? It might be because I'm controlling Placido and he goes to pommel into an underhook and I give space, I move back. And as a result, I can pommel my arm in. Before he can re-pommel, I go forward. So when he tries to re-pommel through, there's insufficient space for him to do so. I don't want to give a pommel and then keep space where we just get into these silly protracted pommeling situations. Okay. Now, are these spaces going to be there for long? Nope. They're going to be there for a very short period of time. You might have to work a little bit for them. So when he goes into pommel, I might just catch my training partner's wrist and my chest and stomach. So when he tries to pommel through, it's not so easy. I might have to change my angle relative to my training partner and come around to the side to come through and pommel in. I might have to change my arm position from crossface to reverse crossface to get what I want. It might be that which enables me to pommel in. It might be that I switch from side control to knee on belly. And as he goes to push an arm off, that might be all that it takes for us to go into the underhook situation. Whatever it takes. What we want to do here is keep an eye on our opponent for a 90-degree bend in his arm or greater. Okay, if it's less, it's hard to pommel in. There's very little space. But as the hand goes down the body, more space develops to get the hand inside. As it increases still further, it becomes easier and easier to get the inside position. Okay, but around 90 degrees is the minimum. In addition, the more my opponent's elbow comes off, say for example he's bench pressing me up, there could well be opportunities from in here where we can take an arm down, go through and pommel into our training partner's arm. Okay, often it has to do with changes in angle. If I'm here relative to my training partner, it could be hard sometimes to pommel in, but there'll be plenty of times where if I change my angle relative to my training partner and put knees over my training partner's head, that from here, that change in angle, suddenly it's a lot easier to get my underhook in place and start to go to work from these positions. Okay, so any one of these things, a change in height to knee on belly will often open up a spontaneous underhook. A change in his hand position from here to here will often create opportunities to punch in. A change in crossface position from regular crossface to reverse crossface will often create conditions where as he goes to move his arm around, you'll be able to punch in. A change in angle relative to my training partner will often create situations where you can pommel through into an underhook and work from positions like so. Okay? Keep your eyes open. Don't just doggedly go through the motions of pinning people. At all times, ask yourself, is his hand moving down to a 90-degree angle? If it ever is, and if this coincides with changes in angle, changes in height, or any of the other conditions we looked at, you will often be able to spontaneously pommel your hand in and steal the inside position from him in the blink of an eye. These methods of entering aren't controlled by you. They arise as spontaneous opportunities. Keep your eyes open for them, because when they arise, they can make your job as the pinner looking for submissions a lot easier. We're looking at this idea of penetrating our opponent's elbow as the first step in our side system. we know that our opponent will be in a defensively responsible stance, just like so. It's going to be hard to get submissions from here. You might have side control, but it doesn't mean anything in terms of getting submissions. The path to submitting people isn't the pin, it's the pin plus the isolation of a limb, where you have a limb isolated and under your control. Now you can start submitting people. Just having the pin by itself, it doesn't mean anything in terms of submissions. It's a good position, but you're not going to submit anyone just by holding them like this. No one ever got submitted by being hugged, okay? It's not until you can start isolating limbs and drawing elbows out and away from the body and getting backs off the floor. Now you can start submitting people, okay? Hugging them tight in here isn't going to submit anyone. So the natural question is, how do you take someone out of a good, strong defensive structure and start creating opportunities to get to your underhooks and isolating limbs? What are we going to do? Well, we've seen the 10-finger method. We've seen that sometimes we can spontaneously pommel our arm into good positions like this. Another great method is a fake American lock. Okay, now the American lock is one of the moves you learn in your first days in jiu-jitsu. Okay, where you get a hold of your training partner's wrist, you lock up the figure of 4, and from here you bring the arm down and finish people. It's a good lock. Mechanically, it's very strong. If you actually get the position, it's very strong. It can create very traumatic breaks for your opponent. But you hardly ever see it in top-level competition. Okay, it's very, very rare that someone gets finished with it in top-level competition. It usually means that there's a big size and strength discrepancy, or one of the guys is exhausted. Other than that, you just don't see it much. Now, there's a reason for that. It's because it's pretty easy to defend. It's mechanically a strong lock once you get it in place, but it's pretty easy to defend. So I don't use it so much as a submission hold as a means of gaining an underhook. If Placido has good defensive posture, I'm just going to put my forearm underneath his elbow. Good news is that's actually pretty easy to do. Let's have a look at this. If the camera could just close in on the elbow, okay, you're always going to see, no matter how tight your opponent's elbow is to his ribs, there's always space for me to slide thumb and half my wrist under the elbow. I don't care how tight his elbow is in, you can always do that. It's not asking much, okay? So once again, no matter how tight the arm is, you can always slide here. Now, you don't have the elbow under control because you're not underneath his bicep, okay? But you do have some kind of meaningful penetration underneath the elbow. It's not the full penetration and control of the elbow that we seek, but it's a beginning, okay? So here we are, we're across side. I'm going to take my forearm and go through as far as I can, okay? I'm going to take my hand up and touch my own cheek, and I'm going to hit a partial sit through. Nothing crazy, just a partial sit through. In one motion, I'm going to take my hand, I'm just going to quickly catch a hold of my training partner's wrist. Presumably, he's going to have his hands in tight in a good defensive position, okay? So once again, I start off just in here. His elbows are in tight. Look how I walk my wrist underneath, and I get underneath into this position, okay? Now, from this position, I start by getting a hold of my training partner's wrist. I'm just going to push his wrist in an outwards direction and feed it through into my hand and lock it up. Okay, so no matter how tight he is in here, look how I just make that quick pass and my hands go through and lock. As soon as we're in there, we bring our body up and we attempt the American lock. Now, the American lock, as I said, if I can get my right elbow, in this case my right elbow, if I can get my right elbow up onto his ribcage, I'll snap his arm like a twig. But Placido will bridge to relieve pressure and he will spontaneously straighten his arm. Boom, and I lose the lock. You see this a lot, okay? That's why the move tends to work well in beginners classes, but not so much in advanced classes, okay? Because it's relatively easy for an opponent to anticipate the danger and begin straightening his arm before we can get a full finish. So here we are. I take my wrist underneath and lock up. From here, we get good control of our training partner's wrist. Now I just find his wrist and I quickly push it through and I get that initial lock. Now, even as I come back up, I see him extending his arm before I can get the break. But what have we got now, fellas? You guessed it. You've got the underhook you were really looking for all along. And now you've got good isolation of your training partner's arm. Okay? So we'll change the angle a little bit, Placido. Okay, here we are. Placido's got his good defensive structure up, okay? Because he's got good defensive structure, you're not going to take a guy like this and just get a submission hold from side control. You got to break his defensive structure first. The general pattern that we're trying to push upon you guys is the idea that you get your position first, you break his overall defensive stance and structure second, and you get your submission hold third. You guys have been told since the first day you did jiu-jitsu, get position first and submission second, okay? That's fine up to a certain level. That's fine when there's punching and striking involved. But when it's just pure submission grappling and you've got a disciplined opponent who understands good defensive structure and has good escapes, you're going to have to add an extra step. You're going to have to get position first, side control. You're going to have to break his defensive stance and structure second. That means getting inside and underneath and penetrating the elbow. And then you're going to have to do your submission holds. Okay, we're using a fake American lock to satisfy the second move, to penetrate your opponent's elbow, in this case with an underhook. So here we are, Placido's got his good defensive structure. We're going to start by taking our wrist and feeding it through underneath. I don't care how tight his elbow is in. You can always feed your wrist through and underneath. Now, as we come around the corner on our training partner, we start the section of hunting for our training partner's wrist. And I just spontaneously come through and we just hit that quick American. Now, it takes time for me to get my elbow up onto his ribcage. If I can get it, it's all over. Placido knows that. So he takes a little heat off the American lock and straightens the arm out, and finds himself, he's gotten out of the American lock. But he did so at the price of surrendering the underhook. And that was my game all along. I didn't really expect to get an American lock on someone like Placido. He's too good for that. I expected to get the underhook. Now from here, we plant, we get our elbow to the sternum, and we're in a fine position now to go into all the various attacks that we favor from this position. So just one more time, fellas. Our goal is an underhook. Can't do that right now. Placido's got very good defensive structure, okay? So we start off from side control. I work the wrist in. I get good control over my training partner. And then from here, okay, I spontaneously find my training partner's wrist. They come in hard for the American. He goes to now, and now we prop, get our elbow inside, and we're in perfect position now to control our opponent, courtesy of the underhook. So that forms a really practical way to get to that underhook on a skilled, talented, disciplined opponent. Now, we're looking at the idea of penetrating our opponent's elbow. We've seen that when someone's in bottom side control, the whole focus of control is your opponent's elbow. Why the elbow? What's so special about the damn elbow? Well, the elbow is the focus of two things for my opponent. First, if I don't control his elbow, it's very, very difficult to make a conversion from the pin to a submission. Okay, so that's the first problem. Second problem is if his elbows are in good position, all of his escapes will follow from good elbow position. So if Placido has good elbow position, he can elbow escape near side. If Placido has good elbow position, he can underhook far side and start coming up into counters. Okay, so all of his major escapes all involve good elbow position. If I can steal good elbow position from him, I set up all of my submissions and I take away his ability to escape. That's why the battle for the elbow is the first battle to win once you start pinning people. Now, when we looked at the mounted position in a separate video, we saw that essentially the only way you can really realistically win the battle for the elbow is through the underhook. We've seen from side control, we can use the same principle. The underhook works just fine from side control. But the good news is that from side control, you've got two ways you can win the battle for elbow control. One of them doesn't apply to the mounted position at all. This is the reverse overhook. So we've been looking at the idea of underhooking, where we take the arm down and I underhook my opponent's arm. And certainly that's one of the very best ways to do it. But you get a great second option as well. We'll just change the angle a little bit. Okay, first off, what the hell is a reverse overhook? A conventional overhook is my opponent's left arm overhooked, grab my waist, and versus my right overhook. So my arm goes over and around his arm. And you can do this in various kinds of ways. You can grab your own thigh, grab your own stomach, and come up high, whatever you want. The commonality is that he has an arm around my leg, waist, around my armpit, whatever he wants, and I go over and overhook my opponent's arm, sometimes called a wizard. Okay. Now, that's conventional overhook. What's a reverse overhook? That's where instead of using my right arm against his left, I use my left against his left. So from a side position, in like so, I come up north on my training partner, and I take my wrist underneath my training partner's arm like so, and from here, I have an overhook on my training partner's arm, left versus left. Okay, so it's the opposite of normal. And from situations like this, you can get tremendous control of your opponent. What have you got? You've got a penetration of the elbow in the opposite direction. Just turn on your side there. So you're penetrating the elbow from the outside in instead of penetrating the elbow from the inside out. So understand that an underhook penetrates the elbow from the inside out, and a reverse overhook penetrates the elbow from the outside in. Okay, so that's the essential difference between the two. Placido, just have your feet towards the camera, buddy. Okay, so the basic idea, So the basic idea in a reverse overhook is that I go underneath my training partner's arm and lock in like so. I curl my wrist to the inside and I start that driving forward action so that my right overhooks his right, the opposite of normal. Normally it's left versus right, now it's right versus right. And it puts tremendous pressure onto my training partner. Now, as amazing as this move is, spin the other way, man. As amazing as this move is, there's an obvious problem with it. If my opponent has really tight, disciplined elbow position, it's going to be difficult to get underneath his elbow with my wrist. Okay, your wrist is pretty thick, and there's not that much space from the outside angle to get underneath. And so you often run into this problem. You get your thumb underneath, but you can't get that much wrist. So Placido turns to his left and slipped his elbow out. Okay, don't hide it with your legs, mate. Just don't move your legs so much. Okay. So from here, he turns left, go, and out comes the elbow. Okay, so even if you hold in there tight as best you can often lose an elbow. So it's not always easy to penetrate and get what you wanted, which is a deep penetration of the elbow, like so. Okay, and just working from here, it can be tough to do that. So what are some realistic tricks that we can employ to make it a little easier to penetrate the elbow? One of the best methods is the underclasp. What the hell is the underclasp method? From a situation where I'm across my training partner's side, I'm going to go through and I'm going to physically hold my training partner's wrist with an underclasp. I can use my thumb or I can just go 4 fingers, okay? So when he's playing in these kinds of situations, look how I just take my hand and I slip it in and I punch in. Now, I've got good news for you. I don't care how tight, put your hand on your chest like you're saluting the flag. I don't care how tight your opponent keeps his hand in, you can always get 4 fingers because it's such a thin cross section, and you can always pinch them in. Okay, I don't care how strong your opponent is. I don't care how tight he holds his hand in to his chest. I can always just take 4 fingers and get his wrist. Okay, so here we are, we're playing in this position, and I go through and I secure the wrist. Once I secure the wrist, I can physically pull his hand down towards his belly button. And once the hand goes in, now we've got more than enough space to start securing what we wanted. That good grip on our training partner where I penetrate the elbow from the outside in and get my reverse overhook. Okay, so once again, you've got an opponent who's really doing a good job, maybe even exaggerating that strong defensive position down on the mat. Okay, so from here, we come in and I come through and I grab a hold of the wrist just like so. Now from here, I go in over the top and I physically pull down the mat until we can start that action of locking up. There's our reverse overhook in place, and from here we've got the reverse overhook that we seek, and you've got an excellent connection to your opponent all the way through with complete penetration of the elbow. Okay, so this is a really realistic way of getting to your opponent's elbow even when he's in a very tight defensive structure. Now, we're looking at this idea that attacking from side control, we get 2 great options to penetrate underneath our opponent's elbow. Mounted position, you only get 1. Side control, you get 2. The second method is the reverse overhook. We've seen that when someone is down and we're across their side, you have a choice when it comes time to penetrate the elbow between working from the inside out with an underhook and from the outside in with a reverse overhook. Okay, and they're both excellent methods. Now, if we're going to maximize our effectiveness from side control, you got to be strong at both. Earlier in this video, I said that one of the greatest advantages, and in fact, I would unquestionably say the single biggest advantage of side control, is that it confers much greater mobility to you as the pinner than the mounted position does. When you're mounted, you're mounted. You can only go forwards and backwards. You know, high mount or low mount or some variation of that. Okay, those are your only two options. Side control, you can go from your opponent's right side all the way across to the left side. You can stop at north-south. You can change to a 3/4 angle. You can go towards your opponent's hips. You can come up towards his shoulder line. So many things you can do. You got so much more flexibility in terms of your body positioning and your changes in angles, etc., etc. One of the best things you can do if you want to get a reverse overhook on your opponent is change your angle. Okay, if I'm here working with my training partner, I'm currently at a 90-degree angle to Placido. Okay, and for me to get underneath Placido's wrist from this angle is pretty damn difficult. Placido, could you just swivel around a little bit to your left, buddy? Yep, let me know. Yeah, right there. Good. Okay, so what I will often do, or what anyone should be doing in this situation, is to change the angle relative to your opponent. So if I start at 90 degrees perpendicular to Placido, what I'll do is I'll bring my body around and past the line of Placido's head, and I will sink down his body all the way down by his collarbones, so that from here I have the perfect angle to take my wrist underneath my training partner's elbow, just like so. No matter how tight your opponent is in there, at this angle it's really easy to bring the wrist underneath. Now, as Placido makes his arm strong and resistant, I'm going to focus on taking my hand across his body. So I just do this. Now, I'm not there yet. What I do is I push off my toes now and go into a mild sprawl, just like so. Then I push my training partner's hand down the body. Don't worry, I'll show you the next angle soon. And from here, you guessed it, we have a perfect outside overhook. Okay, so I'm going to demonstrate on the other side now, so you can see the perfect angle. So here we are, we've got Placido in a good defensive position, like so. Okay, I take my hand, I go underneath his wrist, and I change my angle relative to my opponent. I block my opponent at the hip. I don't want to walk around and change the angle, and Placido walks with me. Now nothing happens. I want to immobilize him by blocking his hip. So when Placido goes to walk with me, my forearm prevents it. Now I go down his body all the way to the collarbone. I take my hand, strong arms. I take my wrist inside his elbow and I go across my opponent's body, just like so. Now I drive my right shoulder to his right hip, coming up off my toes into a staggered sprawl. I'm almost there, but I need that last trick to complete the elbow penetration. So I take my hand and I push over the top, almost like I was going for a kind of a kimura. From this position, when I settle down, what have we got? Complete elbow penetration. Okay, so one more time. We're at 90 degrees relative to our opponent. From this position, I block the near side hip, I bring my wrist in, and I start that action of changing the angle relative to my opponent. I sink down his body. I bring my wrist underneath the elbow. I bring everything across the body. I turn my palm up. Move your legs. I turn my palm up so that I get a tighter cinch on my opponent's elbow. I drive my right shoulder to his left hip and I go into a kind of a staggered sprawl, like so. So all the weight is on his diaphragm. Now I push his wrist, and as a result, we have that perfect outside in elbow penetration. And from here, many ways to attack. Okay? So This is a very, very good method of working. It's probably fair to say, guys, that whenever it's time to penetrate the elbow from the outside, this is what I use 8 times out of 10. Okay, I use the other methods that I showed you, but this is the backbone of what I do. I change the angle. Okay, down, Placido. It's really hard to penetrate the elbow just right from here. It's really hard. Almost always what's required is that change in angle. Only that change in angle gives me that ability to drive up onto the points of my toes. And from here, to get the perfect control that we're looking for. And as a result, many ways that we can go on the attack. Okay? So that is, in my opinion, the single best method. It may not be your favorite, but it certainly is mine. And it's definitely one you want to learn. We're looking at this idea of penetrating underneath our training partner's elbow. This is step number 1 of the side control system. You've got to be able to control your opponent's elbows. Guys, I've said this before and I'll say it again. The first step in beating your opponent from side control is beat his elbow. That's the battleground. That's the battleground that you're fighting over. He's down. As long as he's got integrity of elbow position, he can elbow escape, he can knee escape, do whatever he wants. And it's really hard for me to submit him. The minute he starts losing elbow integrity, okay, starts getting into situations where the elbows drift away from the sternum, where the elbows come across the center line. The minute this kind of thing happens, you got back exposure, you've got arm exposure, you've got all kinds of crazy neck exposure. Okay, and that's where the magic can start happening. That's when you can start submitting people. Just doing this isn't going to submit anyone. It's only when you start penetrating the elbow and controlling and isolating limbs, that's when you start submitting people. Okay, that's the direction I want your minds working. Win the battle for the elbow first. That way he won't be able to escape on you. You're not trying to battle his escapes while you're going for submission holds, and you can start finishing people with the most high percentage finishes in the sport. Now, we're looking at the idea of penetrating the elbow from the outside, courtesy of a reverse overhook. We just looked at what I sincerely believe is the number 1 method. That's the walk around method. The reason why I believe it's the number 1 method is because it changes angle. Just like a good boxer never stands directly in front of his opponent where he can get hit and he has no advantageous angle, but is always looking to move to the outside and form advantageous angles where he can punch around, through and under his opponent's guard. That's when he starts making contact with his with his opponent. So too, a good jiu-jitsu player never tries to hammer in the front door. He's always looking to get angles on his opponent. And so from the side control position, I will switch from Placido's right-hand side and start coming around to a kind of a hybrid left-hand side, quasi-north-south, quasi-side control. So I'm going across that diagonal line from one shoulder across to the opposite hip, so that if I ever get underneath that elbow, I can start putting real pressure on my training partner. And I can start coming up and into full elbow penetration like so, okay? Now, from Placido's perspective, what do you think is the smart thing for him to do? The smart thing for Placido to do is to get that elbow down to the floor. Why? Because if I penetrate underneath that elbow here, if I hold it in place and start driving it towards the center line, I'm winning. But if Placido bridges off his right foot and drives his elbow to the floor, he wins. Okay? I've lost the elbow. Okay? So I want his elbow going to, and stop. I want his elbow going to the center line. He wants his elbow going the opposite way. And the limit of what he can do is the floor. So when I get to a situation where I get underneath his wrist, I'm trying to drive to the center line, he's bridging and driving back the other way, I'm fighting the whole strength of his bridge, and I lose it. Okay? Oh, Placido, you're getting weaker. Feeble. Yeah, feeble.
Is the word you're looking for.
It's hard to fight the strength of his bridge. Bridge is a very, very strong physical action in the human body. It's hard to fight the strength of his bridge just with my wrist. Okay? I don't care what a good job I do with my sprawl and getting my weight behind it. It's not easy. I weigh more than Placido, and this time, Placido, don't be polite to me, just boom.
You want to explode?
Yeah, explode. So when I come in here and I try to hold it, he just explosively turns. I'm not going to hold that elbow, okay? It's not going to happen. You add some sweat in there, you add some fatigue late in the match, it's not going to work that way. But Placido's going to do what he just did solo. And I want you guys, even though the battle's being fought on this elbow, relax. Even though the battle's being fought on this elbow, I want you guys to watch this elbow. So let's say I was on top of Placido and I took his elbow across the center line, and Placido's freaking out. He said, oh my God, if my elbow goes across the center line, he's going to penetrate the elbow, he's going to expose my back, he's going to do all those bad things. So Placido explosively bridges off the other one. And what happened to this elbow? It elevated. The only way Placido can save his left elbow is to expose the other one. And we're going to learn to take advantage of that. So, here I am. I'm perpendicular to Placido. I lock up. I change my angle, just like we did in the walk around move. And from here, I put some serious heat on Placido, and I'm driving on the other side. Okay? As I fight for Placido's right arm, he goes back the other way. And what have we got? Elbow penetration on the opposite side. Placido fought like a dog to defend his left arm, and ended up giving me his right arm. Okay? So once again, we start off across side. I change my angle, and I get to this position here, underneath both his elbows. Okay? Kind of a two-gun position. You got both of them at the same time. And then from here, I start driving. As he fights back hard in the opposite direction, I go through and I get my elbow penetration on the opposite side. Once you understand that your opponent can only defend left by sacrificing right and vice versa, you're going to use the switching method against highly resistant opponents to get that elbow penetration you seek. Now, we look at this idea of converting a pin into a submission hold. The big theme that we're trying to push on you is this idea that most people look at jiu-jitsu in terms of position to submission. And that's certainly a great way to begin your study of jiu-jitsu. It's also a great way to work in self-defense situations, because the position by itself is often enough to use a combination of elbows and punches to make people go into defensive reactions that the submissions come pretty easy. That all changes in submission grappling, where you're not allowed to punch or elbow people, and you have to use some kind of mechanical method of taking them out of tight defensive positions. We've seen with Al Placido that in submission grappling, the whole initial battle is going to be the battle over the elbow. Okay? If your opponent's elbows are in good position, he can escape fairly easily, and it's very hard to submit him. We need to get his elbows out of position. And the first step in that battle is what we call elbow penetration, where I get my forearm between his upper arm and his rib cage. And as a result, I can control my opponent. You got two options. You've got inside out penetration with an underhook, and you have outside in penetration with a reverse overhook. Okay? Now, penetrating the elbow is a start. It's a good start, but it's not enough. You need to go beyond penetrating the elbow and into the idea of separating the elbow. What does separating the elbow mean? Well, in the case of the mounted position, separating the elbow means taking the elbow up above the shoulder line. But that doesn't really apply in side control because the angle's wrong. It works in the mounted position because you're lined up with your opponent, okay? You're parallel with your opponent. So taking the elbow north, up and over the shoulder line makes perfect sense. But in the case of side control, you're perpendicular to the man, so you can't walk the elbow up. In the case of side control, separating the elbow means taking the elbow towards the center line, this way, okay? He wants his elbow at his side. You want his elbow coming towards the center line, and that creates arm exposure, ultimately neck exposure, and back exposure. And all of them are good news for you, okay? So you got these two phases. First phase, you got to penetrate the elbow. And we've seen already a good bunch of ways to do that. Now you got to go into phase two, which is to separate the elbow from a tight defensive position at the ribs to a poor defensive position going towards the center line, like so. Okay, and we're going to do it in the case of the reverse overhook. The method we're going to use is one of the most important movements in all of side control pinning. So I want you to pay particular attention to this. I'm going to go through a ton of details on how to make this work. Time invested in this move is going to be worth its weight in gold, I promise you. Okay, this is what's going to make you a very, very effective pinner and finisher from side control. Okay, so we've seen a bunch of ways to penetrate from the outside and penetrate the elbow from the outside position. Let's look at one of them now. We'll go up. On a training partner, we'll change the angle relative to our training partner. We saw that if we get our wrist across the sternum, and then from here we start that action of closing our shoulder towards the opposite hip, just like so, and turning our body out. So we're crunched around our training partner like so. Don't be square with your hips. When your sprawl is square, it's very easy for Placido to turn back into you and slip his elbow inside, okay? There's a big difference between a square sprawl, like so, versus a staggered sprawl. We want the staggered sprawl. Why? Because it puts all of your power into that hand that's penetrating underneath the elbow, as opposed to here, where it puts significantly less weight on the elbow. You do a simple experiment. You can feel 100% of your weight going through that elbow. That's going to be transmitted onto your opponent. So he will feel it very, very acutely. So we've come up to a kind of quasi north-south position, and from here I go through and lock. Now watch my left shoulder go towards his right hip. So I bring my foot out, swish a step, and I come up into that staggered sprawl, walking my body up like so. And as a result, Placido will tell you there is a tremendous amount of pressure over his diaphragm.
Yep.
Okay? It's a very, very uncomfortable thing to have to bear. So I'm going to demonstrate from the other angle. So this one. From here, I come through and lock. Watch my right shoulder now go towards his left hip. I turn, drive, my head and ear come down like so. My hips up high, my body rotating, and as a result, Placido feels everything in his diaphragm. If Placido tries to repeat the alphabet,
A, B, C.
You'll hear it in his voice, okay? There's a lot of pressure over the diaphragm. Your whole goal is to interrupt his breathing through the diaphragm with this position, okay? So regardless of which side we use, I come in, look how I bring my shoulder crunching, and I rotate my fist. So I go from palm down to palm up. Palm down to palm up, walking, and I connect my ear to the opposite hip. So when he starts to hold this position, you'll feel the compression in his diaphragm. It's a miserable experience to have to go through. Look how my whole body is lined up with my left leg. My left shoulder, left hip, and left leg form a straight line. And all of that is connected to his hip through my left ear. When I change sides, and I come through on the other side, now everything will be lined up right side, right shoulder, right hip and right leg are all in a straight line. Right ear on his hip, like so. I can use my hand for stability. And poor Placido will feel everything in his diaphragm. Excellent control, okay? Now, that's the first part of this, sorry Placido, rather miserable experience for the person on bottom. Now, as brutal as that is, you've only begun the idea of elbow separation, because ultimately what I want to do is to make his elbow migrate to his opposite shoulder. That's the separation that I seek. This is good elbow position for Placido, right here by his side. I want to penetrate the elbow first and then drive his elbow across the center line to his opposite shoulder. If I can do this, his elbow is completely separated. This is the side control version of what we did from the mounted position, where we bring the elbow above the shoulder line. Now we bring the elbow across the center line to the opposite shoulder. The only way you can do this is the rotational method. So what this involves is first a drive to the opposite hip. We've just seen that. And then ultimately a drive to the opposite shoulder. So I change my angle. I was side control. I change my angle. I come through, lock. My fist rotates from palm down to palm up. I come up off the floor and I lock, just in like so. Now, Watch my hand. I'm going to take my hand and put it in behind my training partner's head. And I'm going to walk 1, 2, 3, 4. And I'm going to drive his elbow towards the opposite shoulder. Placido goes to repeat the alphabet.
It's a miserable experience.
That wasn't a very good alphabet, Placido.
A, B, C, D.
You can get the effect. It's right over his diaphragm. Now, from here, I grab the wrist. I move in and lock the figure of 4. And as a result, you have a complete grip here on your training partner's elbow. If he tries to turn back into you, you have that leverage control of the elbow. And you've got a good figure 4 head and arm, which is going to be very, very hard for your opponent to get away from. Now, I'm just going to do this without Placido's elbow. Just have your arm in, buddy. So, look how my first drive is towards Placido's opposite hip. So, I started side control. I came around and I locked, okay? And my first drive was to the opposite hip, okay? Then I blocked the head and I walked 1, 2, 3, 4. And then I faced the opposite shoulder. And then I drive towards the opposite shoulder to turn his body and expose his elbow. Okay? Now let's change our angle, Placido.
Let me know.
Good. Okay. So,
Legs down.
yeah, perfect. That way they can see everything. So, I come in and I get the wrist in here. I bring it as far across the center line as possible. I switch from palm down, and as I drive, I go palm up. I drive my right shoulder to his opposite hip, loading everything up. Now from here, I block Placido's head. And I start that action of walking. 1, 2, 3, 4. And then I drive to the opposite shoulder. If my head is down, he can turn to me and bring his elbow inside. When my head is up, he goes to do the same. Very, very difficult. Now from here, we punch through and I focus on getting my chest behind his rear deltoid. If my chest is not in front of the rear deltoid, if he explosively turns into me, he can beat me. So my whole thing is to get my chest behind his rear deltoid, so that when I hold the position and he goes to turn back into me,
He feels super heavy.
it's very, very difficult. Okay? So, changing the angle again, Placido.
Let me know.
Okay. We're here across side. I change the angle. I come down the body. I lock. There's our first move. Okay. From here, you have an excellent control over your training partner. I block the head. I walk, and drive to the opposite shoulder. I grip and I sink my chest below his rear deltoid. He goes to turn back into us. And it's very, very difficult. From the opposite side. And you can see you get complete control of your poor old opponent the entire time. And I apologize to you, Placido will tell you the entire time you feel like you've got a Cadillac parked on your diaphragm. It's just a thoroughly miserable experience. You remember earlier in the video, guys, that I said there's no direct way to attack breathing from side control, insofar as you can't literally close your opponent's nose and mouth. From mount position, you can do this pretty easily. Okay, just literally putting your shoulder and chest over his nose and mouth. Okay, so if I close everything over the nose and mouth, Poor Placido tries to breathe and can't. So there's no direct way to do that from side control, but there is an indirect way, and you just saw it. The indirect way is through your opponent's diaphragm and lungs. If I do a good job of coming up and then locking in here, you're so directly over the lungs and diaphragm that when your poor old training partner goes to move around and breathe, it's so difficult. He's almost happy when you get behind the rear deltoid. It's like, oh, at least I can breathe. Okay, even though my back's exposed, at least I can freaking breathe. Okay, so he's almost relieved when that happens. Now, one more time, watch my stepping pattern. Okay, this time don't watch what's going on here, watch my feet. So, facing that way. This is good. I come around my training partner, I lock and I drive, just like so. I block my training partner's head. Look how I just walk in short, choppy steps around the corner. Okay, so I'm facing out now in this direction. I was initially facing across the center line to its opposite hip. Then we blocked and I just walked in short, choppy steps around the corner. Now, from here, he goes to turn back into me. It won't be easy. The last piece is me getting behind his rear deltoid, just like so. Okay, and now you've got a really good attacking position. Now, the last piece of the puzzle, elbow position. We're going to have the camera come in close on this one. Placido, you're down with your feet to the camera. Okay. When we come around, there's a trick you're going to have to learn to do with your elbows, which is as you come around to face your opponent's opposite shoulder, your elbows have to close together. Okay, so let's take this 45 degrees. Okay, when I come around the corner and lock up, as I make the head block and I go into the short choppy steps, if my elbow, watch my left elbow guys, my left elbow, if my left elbow flares and Placido turns in, he beats my elbow. Okay, so when I turn up to the head, I have to take my elbow close to my own body. Don't let your elbow flare. If it flares, he turns in with a bridge and he beats me. But when I keep my elbow close to my own body, when he goes to turn into me, I'm increasing the pressure. Yeah. Second thing, don't keep your hand on the floor. No, lift it. So when he goes to turn into you, now, I'm sorry, Placido, from here, grab the wrist and get behind his shoulder. Okay, so that's the trick with the elbow. Now, I'm sorry, Placido.
That was a bad one.
Yeah, sorry, bro. Now, when you employ this method in this fashion, you can put ungodly pressure on your opponent, which completely separates his elbow from a position of safety and will set up some of our favorite attacking positions out of side control. So this is how we use the walk around method, emphasizing short, choppy steps that take us from one side of our opponent's body to the other. There's two directionalities of force. The first goes down a diagonal line from opposite shoulder to hip, and the second is from opposite hip to shoulder. So you go like a cross of your opponent's body. You finish with your chest behind your opponent's rear deltoid. If you can get all those details down and correct, I promise you, you will have a devastating method of controlling an opponent and getting his elbow out of a position of safety and into a position of extreme vulnerability that will set up many high percentage submission holds for you and make you someone who converts pins into submissions. We're looking at the idea of elbow separation as it applies in the side pin system. We've seen that when we have an opponent down, we never want to allow our opponent to maintain defensive integrity where he's got his elbows right there close to his side. It's from these elbow positions that my opponent will be able to escape. It's from these elbow positions that he's going to deny my ability to submit him. So ultimately what we're always looking to do is to get our forearm between his elbow and his rib cage. Initially, it just starts as a kind of a penetration, which can be either from the inside with an underhook or from the outside with a reverse overhook. Then it's all about our ability to physically separate his elbow from his ribs. In the case of the mounted position, separation was always up and over the head. But in the case of side control, it's much more about bringing the elbow across the center line. We just looked at how to do this out of a reverse overhook. Now let's look at how to do it out of an underhook. From any situation where I'm able to penetrate underneath my opponent's arm and get that underhook, you're going to see that my training partner's rib cage becomes a fulcrum, and my lower arm, the forearm, can become a lever, which can direct and move your training partner. Okay? Now, as wonderful as this is as a means of pulling an opponent up onto his side, it becomes even more powerful when we start incorporating other aspects of our body and starting to put physical pressure on our training partner. When we use this grip, the first thing we want to make sure of is that we take our elbow inwards to the sternum. I don't want my elbow coming down to the belly button. That's where Placido can pommel his arm to the inside. So the first thing we want to do is close everything up and bring the elbow in towards the sternum. Second thing, I want my shoulder to go here, just above his elbow, so that when he goes to pull his arm free, it's very, very difficult. If there's no contact with my shoulder, Placido can pommel and bring the hand inside and start causing problems. So I want my forearm under my training partner's bicep, and I want my shoulder on top. My second hand is a base of support, just like so. Now we want to start taking our knees off the floor and arching our body into a sprawl so that Placido bears all my weight in this position. When my knees come down to the mat, Placido feels very little pressure. Okay, so again, it starts with penetration under the elbow, courtesy of the underhook. Then we draw our training partner up onto his side and begin to bring the elbow towards the center line. Our shoulder goes over our training partner's forearm, and we come up almost into a north-south type position with my ear close to his hips. My hand is a base of support, and from here, my knees off the mat. So there is considerable pressure over my training partner. When he goes to pull his arm free, it's not going to be an easy thing. He's going to have to work very, very hard indeed to extricate his arm from this hold. This puts considerable pressure on our training partner and ensures that he won't be able to pull his arm back and away from us. If Placido can bring his hand back, away, and pommel into an underhook, that's going to cause problems. If he can simply pull his arm out and then get his arm back into a good defense position, obviously that's a problem. So our whole thing, once we penetrate with the underhook, is to form that good lever all the way up there by the sternum. So a considerable amount of physical pressure goes through the bony elbow into the sternum just by itself. Then when we start to add body weight into this formula and arch, just like so, now you've got a really powerful pin. When he tries to work his way out, it's a very difficult thing indeed. Okay, so that's how we use the forearm lever, using your elbow right in your training partner's sternum, getting your body weight onto your opponent and putting considerable pressure through your elbow onto your opponent's sternum. As we go through this video, we're looking specifically at the skill of converting side pins into submission holds. And we're looking at a systematic way of doing this as we go through the video. There's a special study that I want to just interrupt things with now, because it really will pay dividends to your pinning performance throughout your jiu-jitsu career. I want you to become a devastating pinner. Okay, someone who, if you pass someone's guard, people fear your pins. And let me give you a piece of advice that you can carry for the rest of your time in jiu-jitsu. The key to becoming a devastating pinner is to always attack your opponent's breathing. Most pins in jiu-jitsu are actually pretty comfortable. If you Just take bottom position, Placido. If you go into just a basic mounted position here, it's not particularly uncomfortable for Placido. Okay, it's just a guy sitting on your stomach. No one's intimidated by this. Similarly, with side control, if you go in here and you just hold someone across side, you can certainly immobilize them to a degree, but there's nothing particularly intimidating about the position itself. There's a sense in which most people only use pins as a kind of hug, where they just hug their opponent, and no one ever got intimidated by a hug. Now, it's true, you can start to add certain amounts of pressure. A good crossface can turn a pin into an unpleasant experience. Okay? But again, unpleasant isn't really going to cut it at the higher levels. In order to truly intimidate your opponents, you're going to have to attack their breathing. When it comes to pinning and jiu-jitsu, there's two ways that you can attack your opponent's breathing. There are direct methods which go after your opponent's airways. These are the mouth and the nostrils. If you can cover your opponent's mouth and nostrils, you are directly attacking the airways to breathing. And this can create strong panic attacks in a relatively short period of time. These are best done from the mounted position. Then a second method is to attack your opponent's lungs and diaphragm. And these are best done from side positions. Okay? Now, let's quickly go through this. If I'm mounted on someone, it's very hard for me to apply any kind of direct pressure to the lungs and the diaphragm because my body position just doesn't permit it. The mounted position itself, just getting mounted on someone, does nothing to attack the airways. It's not until we get into the methods of control that we saw in the mounted instructional where we start bringing our opponent's arm up into single chest wraps, where we access the head, access our own tricep, shrug, and bring our training partner's arm into a position where we can sneak forward and then bring our whole chest over our training partner's nose and mouth. So Placido's breathing is severely interrupted. In situations like this, as we hold in on a training partner, they get to a point where the amount of effort they're exerting in the middle of a grappling match greatly outpaces the amount of oxygen they're bringing into their lungs, and you start getting very strong panic reactions. Okay, the idea is that I'm going to use the whole surface area of my chest closed over in that tight wrap position over my opponent's nose and mouth. So once again, from the mounted position, we saw the idea of securing an underhook, a crossface, and then using the ratchet method to walk our training partner's arm north until we get to a point where we can grab the head. Once we can get to the head, we take the head off the floor and lift up to our elbow. Then we use the shoulder shrug to bring the arm down. And from this position, we bring our whole body lined up over our training partner's nose and mouth. So when he tries to breathe, he tries to elbow escape. It's very, very difficult. Now, Placido is in a state of relative inactivity, and even an inactive person can be asphyxiated in a fairly short period of time. Now imagine how much worse it would be if you had already been grappling for 10, 12 minutes. You're already breathing hard, you're tired, close to exhaustion, and then suddenly a guy just cuts off your breathing. It's a terrifying feeling, okay? So from the mounted position, the best form of attacks to the opponent's breathing capacity come from the single chest wrap. And the attack on the breathing is a direct attack on the airways, the nostrils and the mouth. Now, that's not really possible in side control. You could only use some kind of silly, hand covering this is not very effective, okay? So from here, from side position, you're much better off attacking the lungs and the diaphragm. And that's going to come out of reverse overhooks and underhooks. Okay, so let's spend a little bit of time looking at this. Okay, my opponent's in a good defensive position. We're across side, and then from here, we walk around to a kind of quasi north-south position. We've seen this idea that if I can get underneath my training partner's forearm and start driving forward, we can come up and start putting a considerable amount of our weight over our training partner, just like so. Okay, this key element here is that once I've penetrated underneath my training partner's elbow, I want to rotate my fist upwards, like so. I want to go right down into my training partner's armpit, and I want to get my shoulder below his elbow. If my shoulder goes above the elbow, his elbow slips out. So the whole thing is to rotate my hand and get my shoulder below his elbow. I want to drive my right shoulder to his left hip. The only way I can do this is by bringing my knees up off the floor into a staggered sprawl. From situations like so, when he goes to pull his elbow free, it's very, very difficult. And you can hear Paul Placido's breathing is severely interrupted. Don't bring your head up. Okay, that brings your legs down into a weaker position and lets him start bringing knees in and causing interruptions. So I want to take my ear down like so and into this position. I use my other hand as an action hand. Sometimes I grab his other elbow and hold it in place. When he goes to move around, maintain that pressure. It's very, very difficult. And from here, so many ways for us to go and to manipulate our training partner's breathing. We can amplify this by lifting the head and rotating all the way in, just like so. So that now the pressure is directly over the lungs. When he goes to breathe, it's a difficult thing. And from here, so many ways to attack an opponent's breathing all the way through. Okay. So once again, I'm sorry, Placido. We're here across side. I'm going to attack this arm. So we come around north-south. In goes the hand. Reverse overhook starts to come forward. I come up on my training partner. And there's that initial drive, that initial position. Now I bring my forearm underneath and I walk. And I drive towards the opposite shoulder. When he goes to turn in towards me, it's so difficult. And there's so much pressure over the lungs. And from here, so many ways for us to go in and cause additional pressure. Okay? The idea is everything starts going towards the opposite hip, and then I rotate back towards the opposite shoulder. So there's two very distinct movements here. Once I get to the north-south position, the first drive is towards the hip. Staggered sprawl. Then the head lifting, and then the big part two, a drive towards the opposite shoulder. When Placido goes to try and push me off and recover, the only thing he can do is turn away to relieve pressure, and that's suicide. It's going to give up his back. Okay? So that's the first method, using the outside or reverse overhook to put pressure on my opponent's diaphragm. Second method comes out of an underhook, where we drive in and we use that forearm lever. I bring my elbow onto the sternum itself. And from here, we sit out on our training partner, putting pressure over the lungs. When he goes to move around, it's a difficult thing to get away from. And so much pressure we can put in on this training partner, making life thoroughly miserable for him. Or everything is centered directly over the lungs themselves. As we pull up with the elbow and the forearm lever, at the same time, my shoulder drives down, we elevate the head. And from here, it's a difficult thing for your training partner even to breathe. Okay? Thank you, Pastor. So, my point to you is this. I want you to become a devastating pinner, someone who is feared in the gym and in competition for their pinning. In the long term, the skill you must master in order to do this is to get away from just the basic position itself, which is good, that's the beginning of things, but go beyond the position to start putting genuine pressure on your opponent to a point where your pin becomes intimidating. And this means attacking your opponent's ability to breathe. From the mounted position, attack the airways, nostril, mouth. Don't do it with your hands. That's a cheap way of doing it. Do it with your chest. Go forward into the single chest rab and attack the breathing from the mounted position with single chest rab, covering the airways. From side control, covering the airways isn't really a realistic option. So you'll want to attack the lungs and diaphragm. And the way to do this is through underhooks and reverse overhooks. If you can get your wrist between his bicep and his rib cage and drive your weight by taking your knees off the floor in the manner that I just demonstrated, you will create tremendous pressure in your opponent's ability to breathe to a point where they're happy to give up their back, where they're happy to give up an arm. It's like, oh, thank God that's over. At least I can breathe. That's the kind of pinning pressure that I want you to develop. And if you walk away from this video with nothing else, walk away with this thought. To become a devastating pressure pinner, start at your opponent's ability to breathe.